The Jack Thief. Oleta Gum woke up on the morning of October 31st and went into the baby's room, knowing exactly what she would find. Emptiness. The crib stood in the middle of the room, white cotton blankets piled up against one side. Outside, the wind turned cold with the season, spat at the house and invaded the open window. Oleta grabbed the worn wooden rail of the crib with a bony hand and cried, her tears running down her wrinkled face and falling onto the cotton sheet that still smelled faintly of Jacqueline. Jack, Oleta had called her. But now Jack was gone. Just like all of the girls that had come before her. And it was always on this day, the first birthday, Halloween, that the Jack Thief came and took them away. Now she would have to wait another year before going into the haunted woods to claim her prize. Unless she could find out where the Jack Thief took the babies. Unless she could get this one back. Oleta had been several years younger when she had retreated to her house in the woods. Perhaps it was more of a shack, but it served the purposes of shelter and warmth just fine, and that was all she needed now. Shelter and warmth. Maybe it wasn't all she wanted, but it was all she needed, along with a little food every now and then. What Oleta wanted more than anything was a baby. She was not a young woman anymore, 20 years past childbearing age, but that desire had never left her. It was only since the death of her husband that she realized it was an impossibility. Before, she had always prayed for a miracle. Maybe, she had thought, God would fix whatever was broken inside of her and she would finally get pregnant. But it was never meant to be. So her husband had died and she had moved to the woods feeling like, if she was going to be alone, she was going to do it right. But moving to the woods proved to be the source of more joy and sorrow than she would ever know. It was there she met the Jack Thief. There, during the strangest of circumstances. Summer was buried, Halloween standing atop it like a cold gray tombstone, and Oleta didn't see how she was going to spend a winter alone in the tiny shack. She figured her best days were well behind her and there weren't going to be any good ones ahead. She found a length of strong rope in the old woodshed. She was going to take the rope out into the woods, find a good sturdy branch, and hang herself. She didn't plan on learning how to do it properly. If she had to dangle for a while, choking on her own windpipe, then she just figured that would be penance for the awesome sin she was about to undertake. After a brief survey, she found a branch that would do the trick. The rope was slung around her neck to give her frail arms the strength to carry an old wooden ladder. It was a gray day. The clouds were bloated black-gray, threatening rain. Maybe, if it rained, it would help weigh down her body. It took about half an hour to make sure everything was in place. She figured the knot was strong enough to do the trick. Climbing to the top of the ladder, the fiber of the rope scratchy around her neck, the sky rumbled a hungry growl and she hoped it would drown out the sound of her strangling to death. Standing at the top of the ladder, she wondered if she was doing the right thing. But this wasn't a spontaneous decision. It was something she had thought about for a very long time. This was the only way out. The lonely days had become unendurable and she was too proud to be stuck in this constant state of self-pity. The sky screamed. Oleta took a deep breath and kicked the ladder away. She dropped. The rope tightened around her neck. And then broke. She fell to the ground, lightning streaked across the sky, fat cold drops of rain hammered down, and her life changed forever. On the other side of the tree she had tried to use to kill herself, she heard a baby crying. Oleta unfastened the rope from around her neck, not believing what it was she thought she heard. Nursing a twisted ankle, she trudged through the dead leaves, turned soggy, until she found the source of the crying. When she saw the baby, swaddled in black cloth, at the base of the tree, her face split and her tears mingled with the beating rain. Stooping down, she picked up the baby and took it back to the house, wanting to get it out of the rain, wanting to get it into the warmth. Sometimes, Oleta knew, that when a person wanted something so much, it was not necessary to question the source. It was not necessary to question the truth or validity behind that desire. A Christian wanted a God to save her and an afterlife to house her soul when she dies. The Christian does not question these things, she believes them and calls that belief faith. So Oleta believed in her new baby, maybe not so much as born but given to her on this Halloween day. She took it home with her. First, she named her Jacqueline and called her Jack. She loved Jack. She fed her, sang to her, talked to her, cared for her, and took her everywhere she went. She even took her into the town to buy food and clothes, not caring if the folk talked and wondered. They would, Oleta knew, come up with their own reasons why she now had a baby, and those reasons could not come even remotely close to the fantastic truth. For exactly 1 year, Oleta was the mother of a beautiful baby. On Jack's first birthday, Oleta opened the door to her room and discovered the baby gone, the bedroom window open, a cold wind blowing in. The following year, she searched for baby Jack. Searched and mourned because she knew the baby was gone. That was the worst year of Oleta's life, having had something and then lost it. Each day was worse than the one before. Her life had become a spiraling black nightmare as she wondered about who would steal the only thing she had ever wanted. She never found the Jack thief, but she had a picture of him in her mind. The Jack thief was carved from wood and bone. He traveled by moonlight and drank the sorrow of others. He was drawn to this sorrow and, drunk off it, had to create more. Oleta knew the Jack thief had always been there. He was the one who had snapped the rope when the only thing she wanted to do was snap her neck. He did it because she had not suffered enough. She was a well of suffering, and the Jack thief had not drunk the last of that well. So he had let her love the baby for a year. And just as quickly, he had taken it away. Now he surrounded her in the woods, watching her, mocking her silently as she searched and searched. A year later, she found baby Jack in the same place she had found her 2 years earlier. The baby was the same size as the very first time Oleta found her, and she had a distinct feeling of falling back 2 years in time. But, once again, the sorrow had lifted. She had her baby. Maybe the circumstances were not normal. Maybe they weren't even believable, but it was nice to hold Jack in her arms once again and feel a year of sadness melt away. Over the next 2 years, the cycle repeated itself. Always from Halloween to Halloween. 1 year of joy. 1 of sorrow. 1 a trick. The other, of course, a treat. After losing Jack again, Oleta did not search for her. She sat in her house and waited, her mind expanding out into that depressed madness, knowing her time would come again. Yet knowing that did not make it easier. The only thing she could think of was the year after that, when she would have to go without the baby again. The trick year. And, after all, wasn't the point of having a baby to watch it grow? To shape it and give it a good life? To see what kind of adult it became? That year, Oleta decided she was not going to go without Jack again. On October 31st, when she found Jack under the tree, Oleta said to her, "I'm never letting you go. If he takes you again, I will find you." And she took the baby back home, and they had another good year, the treat year, but now the time had come again, and Oleta stood in an empty room, surrounded by nightmares. That morning, she left the house in search of the Jack thief, knowing he was out there, somewhere. She was not going to go back home until she found the baby. For days, she wandered deeper into the woods, the noose of cold and hunger wrapping around her neck. Madness rats nibbled at her brain. She followed the Jack thief. She followed his scent. He smelled like wax and fallen leaves. He smelled like memories. Some nights, she thought she heard the baby crying. Some nights, she thought she heard the Jack thief laughing. She became hungry and confused, knowing she was too far from her house to ever get back. The sorrow was black and swollen in her mind. She let it grow, knowing that the greater the sorrow, the more likely she was to see the jack thief. And then she could take her baby back. On the night of her death, before the jack thief came and took the sorrow away for good, Oleta couldn't open her eyes. She couldn't see the jack thief. But she thought she could open her eyes far enough to see the little black bundle he held in his arms. She pawed at the blankets, wanting to touch Jack's soft baby skin one last time, but the thing inside the blankets was not Jack. It was carved from wood and bone. It smelled like burning wax and dead leaves. And when it opened its mouth, it didn't want milk, it wanted to drink sorrow and a whole life filled with longing. And when it satiated itself on those things, it laughed and moved on to the next person in the next town. Next story. The Screaming Orchard. You know, we could just walk, Nya said. Her real name was Stephanie, but she hated that name and all of its usual derivatives. Chris, lying on top of the ancient baby blue escort, said, "I'm way too high to walk, probably fall down." That was your idea. Maybe somebody will come along and pick us up. Look around you, Chris. This road probably sees like 2 cars a day and we're one of them. Besides, you have blood all over you. And that, sweetie, was your idea. I thought it would be fun to get out of the house. There are other things to do besides messing around in your parents' basement, you know. Maybe for you. You're all I need. Besides, I promised them I'd stay and pass out candy. You left the bowl out, didn't you? Yeah. But you know how that is. One of those punks will come along and take all the candy, probably the bowl with it, and then some other punks will egg the house or something because they think we're those people who are too cheap to give out candy. Christ, you think too much. I think we should have stayed there. Nya looked around them, the endless fields of golden brown corn divided only by the narrow strip of the gray road. At least it's warm, she told herself. A perfect day to go trick-or-treating, if she were like 4 years younger. She had been looking forward to going to Donna's party, and Chris's indifference was really starting to irritate her. What the fuck are you supposed to be, anyway? She asked him. I'm a butcher, he said, staring up at the clear blue sky. And that's scary how? I don't know. I just thought it looked grisly. He sat up, brought his feet around the side of the car and scooted off. You look like a murdering soda jerk. Do they still have those? I don't know. Butchers wear hats, don't they? I don't know what butchers wear. And what are you supposed to be? I'm a ghoul. I think this is just your excuse to look goth. Well, I don't know what a ghoul looks like. That's okay. You look hot. I mean it. Didn't you get enough last night? She pulled her black shawl over the cleavage showing above the black corset. Enough of you? Never. But you're too high to walk. Completely different muscles. Pervert. Besides, I couldn't possibly fuck anyone who has their hands in animal parts all day. Geez, vegetarians. And my boyfriend's vegetarian. He wouldn't like that. Chris walked up to her and put his hands on her hips. Have I told you how much I like role-playing? He leaned down to kiss her black lips and she pulled away. Car, she said. Chris turned and squinted down the road. Van, he said. A white, unmarked van. We should hide rather than trying to bum a ride from them. Nya watched the van come toward them from the darkening eastern horizon. But, she said. If we can get them to take us back to your house, then I can call a tow truck and we can take your car to the party. I'll make it worth your while. She reached down and cupped his stiff penis with her palm and whispered into his ear, Don't you want to know what it feels like to fuck the dead? Chris smiled and said, Okay, okay. You win. Men are such suckers, Nya thought. They both edged up to the side of the road and waved their hands. The van, all white with tinted windows wrapping around the side and back, pulled to a stop just past them. Chris ran up to the driver's side door. The tinted window rolled down and Chris struggled not to laugh at the man in front of him. The man had curly brown hair that looked like it was either a bad perm or a wig, cut in half by a white headband with a red stripe running along the middle. His face was full and round, outdated aviator sunglasses covering his eyes. A brown mustache occluded his top lip. The same exact-looking man sat in the passenger seat. "Anything we can do for you?" the driver asked. Chris stammered and then said, "Yeah, my girlfriend's car broke down and we were wondering if you could possibly give us a lift back into town." "Well, we was kinda headed the other way. We could pay you for gas and time. Just tell me what you need." Chris thought about Nye's promise and realized how desperately he wanted to get home. "No, that ain't necessary. We can probably just go through town and get where we was going just the same." Then he turned to his partner. "You think?" His partner bobbed his white man's afro in agreement. "Great." Chris smiled broadly. "Thanks a lot, you guys." "Yeah, no problem. Y'all can just climb in back there." Chris walked around behind the van and jerked his head at Nye. He let her get up close to him and said, "These guys are kind of strange," before yanking back the van's sliding door. "Hey there," the guy in the driver's seat said when he saw Nye. "Hi." "Thanks guys," she said, pulling the van door shut. "Looks like you guys are ready for Halloween." "Yeah," Nye said. "What are you guys supposed to be?" She asked that because she was convinced they were both wearing wigs and, once inside the van, she noticed they were also dressed the same. They wore matching, outdated track uniforms, white tank tops stretched over their doughy skin and old red running shorts that were way too short. Without seeing them, Nye could imagine the knee-high tube socks, red stripes at the top. "What do you mean?" the driver asked. "For Halloween," Nye said. "Oh," the driver chuckled. "We ain't dressed for Halloween. We're twins. Name's Vincent. Both of us. Our parents' way of a sick joke, I guess." "I'm Chris," Chris volunteered since Nye was still choking on her foot. "This is my girlfriend, Nye." "Ni." "Yeah, spelled differently, but said just like those things in the middle of your legs." The van slowly pulled away from the curb. The driver shook his head and said, "'Fraid you're not right about that. We were born without knees. Turn around and show them there, Vince." The passenger swiveled around in his seat and straightened out his legs to show them how the expansive lower thigh joined almost evenly with the calf. He rapped his knuckles on the flesh and it made a doughy patter sound. "That bone there," he said. "For those that's got 'em anyway, is called the patella. That's what we was born without, the patella. I guess we still got the muscles and everything." Chris and Nye gaped in awe. After riding silently for a few minutes, Nye noticed they weren't going in the direction of town. She didn't think anything was strange at first because she thought maybe the twins were planning on taking one of the side roads farther up. She looked at Chris and mouthed, "Where the hell are we going?" To allay her suspicions, Chris asked, "So, you guys from around here?" "Ha-ah," the driver said. "We're from over in Preston." "Never heard of it," Chris said. "You know how to get back to town from here?" "Now, we're not going there just yet. We got some stuff to do. Mike could use your help." "We kind of needed to get back in a hurry," Nye said, icy fingers of fear spreading through her. "Well, now your boyfriend here, he was willin' to pay us, said anything you want. I reckon we need us some help." Nye leaned forward in her seat and said, "That's not part of the deal. If you want cash, that's fine, whatever you want, but we've got places to be and parents that are expecting us. Just ease up, honey. We ain't a couple of sickies. We just need your help, that's all. Nya clenched her jaws, ready to lash out at them. Chris reached over and put his hand on her knee and spoke in her place. What, exactly, will we be helping you with? Just a little, the driver looked at the passenger and they both chuckled. Horticulture. I don't understand, Chris said. You ever hear tale of the June tree? No, Chris said. Don't rightly know why they call it the June tree, since it blooms in October. I've never heard of a tree blooming in October, Nya sneered. Well, this one does. At least it's rumored to. I guess the tree must have been named June or something before. Before what? Chris asked. The way the story goes, a number of years back, probably before any of us was even born, there's this girl named June who got raped and killed out by some woods. But that ain't the really strange part. I mean, that shit happens every day. But now they say that, if you was to be standin' and lookin' at this old dead tree that happens to be 'bout round where they say the girl was murdered, and it was a full moon on Halloween, you'd see the tree become that girl. You'd see it bloom. That's ridiculous, Nya said. The passenger turned around and looked at her and, for the first time, she saw that he had a red number 2 on his tank top. It made her think of Thing 1 and Thing 2, from the Cat in the Hat. It's nothing to be afraid of. It's not like the tree's gonna jump out and getcha. And then he shot his arms out and squeezed the inside of Nya's thighs, a little too close to her crotch for Chris's liking. But Nya took care of herself. After jumping nearly to the roof of the van, she roped out her right arm and punched the guy in the face. The man retreated back into his seat holding his mouth and Nya was pretty sure he was sobbing. She was surprised when the van didn't stop and they weren't asked to leave. Then she heard the passenger say, "She hit me, Vin." The driver reached out and patted his brother's quivering shoulder. "That's all right, buddy. She didn't mean it." "Did you, sweetie?" "Yeah, I did, shitface." She wasn't looking at the driver. She was turned in her seat, scanning the back of the van, looking for some means of escape. On the floor in front of the back seat, she spotted a shovel, a bag of dirt, and a large plastic pot. She looked at Chris and motioned toward the shovel. He reached back for it as the driver said, "You know, you kids got a funny way of showing gratitude." Chris quickly grabbed the shovel and, with his hand somewhere around the middle, wielded it in front of him. "Okay, guys," he said. "Stop the van. We want to get out." Chris met the driver's shaded eyes in the rearview mirror as the man said, "I think you might want to put the shovel down," and then nodded to Thing 2 in the passenger seat. Thing 2 held a gun on Chris. The driver said, "We're gonna go find the June tree. We know right where it's at and we need you to help us dig it up. There's a fella back in Preston that's gonna pay us big bucks for this and you guys are coming along to tell him it's real. That is, if it's even there. If it is real." Nya sensed Chris's powerlessness as he lowered the shovel. The sun had all but left the sky and the van seemed way too dark, charging toward the gold powder harvest moon. "We ain't got long to go," the driver said. "You two better just sit back and relax." Nya shot Chris a look that said, "We're in deep shit." Chris nodded, reached over, and put his hand on her knee. The touch didn't comfort Nya nearly as much as she would have liked. The van slowed down to turn right and Nya pulled the handle of the sliding door. It was locked even though the lock switch itself said it wasn't. Damn child safety, Nya thought. The van turned into a heavily wooded area, making it seem even darker than it actually was. Thing 1 pulled the van into a gravel turnoff and cut the ignition. "You all want to grab that shovel and pot and shit from back there." Nya grabbed the shovel and the empty black plastic pot. Chris grabbed the bag of soil. It was heavy and warm. Thing 1 and Thing 2 got out of the van, came around and unlocked the door. If the twins didn't have the gun, Nya was sure they would be able to outrun them. They were so short and plump, Thing 2 looking pitiful with the trickle of blood oozing down from his mustache. "Now, we're gonna take this here trail. You guys don't wanna try nothin', you hear?" Thing 1 said. He turned and stepped into the woods, Nya behind him, Chris behind her, Thing 2 bringing up the rear. Nya couldn't believe any of this was happening. She tried to think of something, but the red streaks of panic blazing through her head made it difficult. She and Chris had darkness, the cover of the woods, a shovel and speed. But the twins had the gun. Damn the gun. Could they even shoot the gun? They seemed to have some inept quality about them. She doubted their marksmanship. They traveled in their single file line down into a gully, crossed a moss-covered wooden bridge and started up the other side. She decided the best thing to do would be to create chaos. Quickly, she grabbed the shovel with both hands and let the pot drop. She raised the shovel. It was much heavier than she expected, and rather than bringing it down on Thing 1's head, she bashed him in the shoulder. Her plan was to turn and run, charge through Thing 2 before he could figure out what was happening, and just hope Chris had enough sense to follow her as fast as possible. The blast from the gun shot her plan to hell. The body in the trail prevented her from running back the way they had come. It was Chris, face down, the back of his head a glistening mass. She froze. Stood there screaming. "Shut her the fuck up, Vinny." Thing 1 shouted from the ground. Thing 2 shifted the gun to his left hand and drove his right into her mouth, dropping her onto Chris, her hand coming down in his wound, sick and warm and wet. Thing 1 was over by her side now, his hand wrapping up in her hair. "You really fucked up, bitch," he said. "And now your boyfriend's dead." Too afraid to scream, Nya blathered softly toward the moldy-smelling earth. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry," she said. "You should be," Thing 1 said. "We do you a favor and you try and clobber me with my own damn shovel. Now if you don't give us any more hassle, we might think about letting you go after we visit Mr. Martin. Please. Please don't hurt me." Thing 1 smacked her cheek and said, "Get up. We got work to do." She stood up, her nervous body shaking violently. Thing 2 moved closer to her, poked the gun into her ass and said, "You scream any more and we might take it upon ourselves to satisfy certain urges. Understand?" "Yes." "Pick up the pot and the shovel." She bent and picked them up. "We need to hurry," Thing 1 said. "Grab the boy." "We can leave the soil here until we come back," Thing 1 said. "But there's blood all over it." "Fuck that shit. Don't matter. It's Halloween. You think anybody's gonna think anything of coming up on a bag with a little blood on it? Guess you're right. Besides, it'll be gone before anybody sees it. Gimme the gun." Thing 2 passed the gun to Thing 1 and grabbed Chris around the ankles. Thing 1 pointed the gun at Nya and said, "You go first. Just follow this here trail up the hill. You run, I shoot. And then we'll take turns fucking your corpse." Nya turned and started back along the trail, traveling up the hill and into the moonlight. She cringed at the sound of Chris being dragged along the sandy trail. The trail opened up into a large meadow. Dead autumn smell surrounded Nya, dried wild grasses and deep brown thistle crunching under their feet as they walked to the far side of the field. Darkness had brought fog and a chill with it. The fog, still settling, swirled gray and clean-looking over the ground. "It should be just over here," Thing 1 said to Thing 2. Eagerly, he quickened his pace. "Maybe I'll get out of this," Nya thought. Immediately, she doubted herself. She hadn't thought things could get as bad as they had. She certainly hadn't thought the twins were murderers when she and Chris had first entered the van. They came upon the other side of the field. More woods loomed in front of them. A storm last week had knocked most of the leaves from the trees, but these woods contained a lot of eastern juniper cedars, making them seem darker, thicker. Nya didn't want to go into any more woods. Even though they were still in the middle of nowhere, unseen, she found a modicum of security in the clearing. "Ah, here she is, buddy," Thing One said. He had stopped just at the edge of the woods. Nya stood on his right side and Thing Two moved up parallel on the other side of her, so they stood in a semicircle looking down at what? What was she supposed to see that she didn't? "The June tree," Thing Two said. "That's gotta be it," Thing One said. The tree stood about chest high to Nya. She didn't really see anything incredibly strange about it. She supposed that, maybe, it vaguely resembled a human form. Its trunk was abnormally thick for its height. The trunk was as thick as Nya's chest. It was cruciform, so it could be perceived to have a head and arms held out like a martyr. "Why ain't it bloomed?" Thing Two asked. "Shit, I don't know," Thing One said. "It is a full moon, ain't it? I mean, we're not like a day away from a full moon or something, are we?" "No, it's full. I checked the paper, the old farmer's almanac. I even checked online. Maybe it's like that old riddle. You know, if a tree falls and no one's around, does it still make a sound? Maybe the June tree don't bloom unless there's somebody here to look at it. And maybe everyone's just full of shit. Maybe it's just a rumor. You think Mr. Martin would lie to us? I don't know. You seen his pictures? I guess. Should we dig it up anyway? I don't see why it would matter." A shrill scream pierced the crisp night. "Shit," Thing One said. "Fuck," Thing Two said. Nya didn't say anything. She could only gape in amazement as the June tree bloomed. The overall color of it seemed to lighten until it reached the color of pale skin. "Jesus, we've gotta stop that sound," Thing One said. The top of the tree softened, became a waterfall of dark hair spilling over the intersection of the horizontal branches. "Take the boy's shirt off," Thing One said. Thing Two began stripping Chris's shirt off. Nya watched the tree as it slowly became a human female, emerging from the dirt at mid-thigh. Frantic eyes stared at Nya, shooting around in their sockets. The screaming knothole became a screaming mouth. Farther down, two rough places of bark became nipples. The tree brought her limbs down, covering her breasts and her sex, only the limbs were now arms. Thing Two approached the tree and jammed Chris's shirt into her mouth, tying the arms of the shirt behind her head. "All right, now take off his pants and put them over her head." "Makes me nervous to look at her," Thing One said. Then he pointed the gun at Nya. "All right. You better get to diggin'." Nya put the pot down and pulled the shovel out. Again she thought about taking it across Thing One's head and remembered what they had said earlier. She had no doubt that killing her wouldn't be the only thing they did. Fucking creeps. She put the point of the shovel in the dirt about a foot out from the base of the tree and drove it in with the bottom of her foot, suddenly glad she had opted for the Doc Martens rather than the 6-inch heels. As the shovel bit down in the soil, the tree doubled over, thrashing in pain, the pants sliding from her head. A geyser of blood shot up, spraying Nya's face. She dropped the shovel and turned away from the tree, falling to her knees and vomiting. "Shit," Thing One said. "We need to hurry." Nya curled up on the ground, shivering in the cold fog. "Fucking useless cunt," she heard Thing One say. She couldn't bear to look at what was happening. She heard the shovel punch into the fleshy earth. "Now we're gonna put him in her place, right?" Thing Two said. "Yep. Take his legs off at the knee and put the stumps in the pot. She's losing a lot of blood." Nya heard the thwacking of what had to be the shovel coming down on Chris's legs. "Jesus, man, use your fucking knife," Thing One said. Nya lay there and tried to concentrate on the sound the wind made as it rustled through the woods, because if she didn't concentrate on that, then the only thing she could hear were the muffled cries of the June tree and the squelching sound Chris's body made as they put him into the earth. This was a far cry from Donna's Halloween party. She shouldn't have listened to Chris. She should have just walked back to town by herself. But Chris was gone now. She couldn't blame Chris. One of the twins dusted off his hands like someone who just planted a garden of petunias and said, "Well, that's it. Get your tits up here, Missy. We're ready." Nya brought herself to her feet with a faint glimmer of hope. Maybe, now that they've got what they came for, they'll let me go. Or maybe they're saving you for something else. If it came to that, she would force them to use the gun. Thing 1 held the pot containing the June tree, slanted haphazardly from within. When Nya looked at it, the first thing she thought of was that the tree had wilted. Her arms hung down by her sides. Her breasts appeared more pendulous. Her hair hung lank around her face. Where the June tree had once stood, Chris was now buried to just beneath his shrunken penis. He was bent over from the waist, his face in the dirt. Nya figured he was wilted, too. "She don't look too good," Thing 1 said while studying the June tree. "We need to hurry up and get that soil." He started back along the fog-covered meadow, covered in purplish moonlight. Thing 2 held the gun in his right hand and the shovel in his left. With the gun, he gestured for Nya to follow Thing 1. Nya tried to block out the fear and any thought of escaping. She fought to clear her mind completely, free herself from the cat claws of madness scraping at the backs of her eyes. It seemed like an eternity before they reached the blood-spattered bag of soil. Thing 2 gave her the shovel to hold and he lifted the bag easily with one hand. The same bag Chris had struggled so hard to carry. The rest of the walk seemed like an eternity. When they reached the van, Thing 1 sat the pot at the rear and opened up the doors. He took the bag of soil from Thing 2 and unrolled the top of it. The smell that wafted out made Nya gag. She tried her best not to vomit again, but when she saw him dump the soil into the pot, she lost it. At this point, it was little more than a dry heave, but it sucked her energy even further. What came out of the bag looked like entrails and blood, all squishy and glistening. Thing 1 centered the June tree, positioning it upright. Thing 2 handed him the shovel and he packed the offal down around the tree. Then he lifted up the pot and put it in the van, folding the bag back down on the soil and placing that next to the tree. He handed the shovel back to Thing 2 and said, "Better keep that up front with you. Should we dose her before we get back on the road?" Thing 2 said. "I'll let you take care of that." Thing 2 grabbed her around the arm and pulled her up to the passenger door of the van. He stepped back and continued to hold the gun on Nya. "Why don't you reach in there and open up the glove box?" he said. She opened the door, leaned over the seat and turned the faux chrome knob of the glove compartment, conscious of Thing 2's eyes burning into her ass. "Now reach in there and grab that bag." She felt around and pulled out a Ziploc bag, its bottom lined with blue pills. "Pull out 2 of them things and pop them in your mouth. We can't have you going apeshit on us." "I won't," she said quietly. "I promise." "Why should I believe you?" She moved closer to Thing 2 and said, "If you promise you'll let me go, I'll let you fuck me." She looked at the bulge in his red running shorts. "I'll let your brother fuck me, too." A sound blasted behind Nya and she saw the explosion of the gun followed by another blast. It took her a second to figure out what had happened. The first sound was the van's horn. The fright had caused Thing 2 to pull the trigger, but he must have jerked too much because the bullet had missed her. "I think you better take the pills." She reached into the bag and plucked out 2 of them. "What are these going to do to me?" "They're gonna make you sleep. When you wake up, We'll be at Mr. Martin's and you can tell him this here tree's real. And then you'll let me go. Just take the pills. She put them in her mouth and dry swallowed. One of them went down and one of them stuck on the back of her tongue. She gagged. Thing 2 pressed the gun to her lips. Open up, he said. She opened her mouth, the pill tickling the back of her throat. Thing 2 slid the gun into her mouth, pushing the pill down into her throat. She gagged again as the pill went down and Thing 2 pulled the gun out of her mouth. Get in the van, he said. She climbed into the stink of the June tree's soil and Thing 2 shut the door behind her before hopping into the front seat and shutting his door. Once his door was shut, she heard the automatic locks seal the doors. That was it, Nya thought. That was my one chance to get away. The van started and pulled out onto the road. Nya sat in her seat, watching the two brothers. Maybe I could bust out a window. Maybe if I went for their eyes. Jesus, I just want to be home. I want to be somewhere where none of this has happened. I want to wake up from this bad dream. But even as she thought that, she felt her eyelids get heavier, her head fill up with something, and she thought she could feel herself slide ever so slowly and gently out of her seat as the pill wrapped its narcotic fingers around her consciousness. Nya didn't know how long it was before she came to. The van was still moving, she could hear the wheels thumping on the road. She was on her stomach. Thing 2 was beside her. She could smell his meaty breath. His hands were between her legs. He had slid her thong aside. His fingers played with her sex, his thumb massaging her anus. Man, this bitch is dry as a bone, he said. I told you, after we see Mr. Martin, we'll take that money down to Cincy and get us a couple whores. Yeah, but she's young and fresh. Her pussy's real tight. Nya fought off the nausea and opened her eyes to slits. The gun sat abandoned on the console between the two front seats. The rest happened very fast. Nya sprang. She wrapped her hand around the gun, slipped her finger around the trigger, held the gun toward Thing 1, and pulled the trigger. There was an explosion. A spray of red. The screech of tires. Then she was flying. Hitting the pavement and skidding across. Maybe the pills were still in her body because she didn't feel any of it. Knew she had to get away. Thing 2 was probably still alive and he was the one that wanted to do stuff to her. She brought herself to her feet. Jesus, she felt wet all over. Was that blood? Her ears rang and she was having trouble hearing anything else. She walked but her body didn't want to. She didn't hurt. She was numb. Numb all over. The street was lined with houses but most of them were darkened, glowing jack-o'-lanterns sitting on porches for one final night of rot. In front of her, there was a brightly lighted house. Slowly, the house came toward her. A woman who looked like Elvira opened the door. Goodness, honey, what's wrong with you? Need to call police, Nya stammered. Christ, she wasn't going to be able to stand up much longer. Then there was a man standing beside the woman. His hair glittered gold and he wore a pair of gold horns and, they must have been contact lenses because Nya could have sworn his eyes were orange. What's wrong? The man asked the woman but Nya could barely hear him because it sounded like screams were coming from the house. This girl. Such awful screams. She says, it's Halloween. It's Halloween, remember. Those are Halloween sounds you're hearing. That we should call the police, no. This isn't right. Those screams are real. There are too many of them. Too loud. Mr. Martin. What are we going to do, Mr. Martin? Nya stared at the man with the flaming orange eyes as he laughed. She wanted to run around and run back to the road but the road was too far away and her body couldn't run backward anyway so she fell forward, caught herself and tried to run in that direction. There must be a phone. Has to be a phone. And those screams, high and ripe, and she really knew that was where she was going because it was Halloween and she wanted to be surrounded by screams, surrounded by people. She was through the house and out the back door, the night air, the sky spinning around her and beneath the sky, surrounding her, the screaming orchard. She stopped, turned in circles, staring at the people trees around her, the mouths contorted as they screamed at the moon, some of them waist-high, some of them towering against the sky, grown to gigantic proportions. And beside her she felt the hot breath, heard the faint crackle of eyes burning somewhere under all the screaming. A feverish hand stroked her cheek and, after a giddy bout of laughter, she heard the voice say, "Skin like an American beach. Don't you think?" She willed herself to die. She wanted blood loss or broken bones or ruptured lungs to take her away from these awful people, and then she thought of Chris and wondered if it would matter. Nya heard the woman laugh and say, "Oh, definitely, Mr. Martin." Nya screamed. A Halloween scream. It was all she could do. From somewhere outside herself, she heard her sapling scream rise up and join the chorus of the other trees in the orchard. Next story. Glowers Point. Karen Bruckner had just finished knotting the condom when the phone rang. She looked apologetically at Keith and took the cordless from its charger. Instinctively, she knew who the caller was and didn't really know why she resented him so much for calling. Trying to sound like she hadn't just had an orgasm, she said, "Hello. Hey babe, it's me." It was Dan, his cell phone making him sound like he'd had a stroke. "Where are you?" "The signal's terrible." "That's a good question. I seem to be in the middle of fucking nowhere." "Do you know where that's at?" "I've been there before." Keith ran a hand up her inner thigh and she gasped slightly. "So what are you up to?" "Not much, really." "Are you alone?" "For now. Allison and Kim are coming over in a bit. I think we're going to dinner or something." "Okay. I was just calling to let you know I'd be home tomorrow." "Oh, here's a sign. I've just entered Glowers Point, Ohio." The point, Karen thought, her heart leaping around in her chest, stealing the words from her mouth. Although the place name had no significance to Dan, merely hearing the name spoken aloud ripped open a dam of memories for Karen. Immediately, a sense of doom enclosed itself around her bones, robbing her of that post-coital wave of relaxation she'd been feeling. Something bad was going to happen. The signal got choppier. Smacks of static punctuated Dan's words. Karen swallowed, a dry click from her throat echoing back to her. "Be careful, dear," she said. "I'm gonna let you go. I can barely hear you." She hardly even heard her own words. She was someplace else. Closer to Dan than he realized. Someplace that had an insane logic of its own. Someplace that she never wanted to hear of again. Someplace that she certainly never wanted to visit again. The point, as the locals had called it. "Okay. I love you." There was another sound, louder than the static. Different. What came next didn't really surprise Karen. It was like something inevitable finally being fulfilled. Dan screamed, "Oh dear fucking God." The signal ended with a chaotic sonic jumble, followed by silence. "Dan," Karen said. The bad doom feeling intensified, turning into something close to physical pain. Dan. She knew he wasn't there. "What's wrong, baby?" Keith asked, moving his hand up to her breasts. Men are so fucking clueless, Karen thought, scraping his sweaty hand off. "It's Dan. Something's wrong with Dan." Immediately, Karen was out of bed and pulling on her clothes. She felt Keith's eyes rolling over her body. "Ah, fuck Dan. Come back to bed. Shut the hell up." Less than 5 minutes after Dan had called, Karen was in the car and headed for I-71 southbound, thoughts caroming violently around in her head. She was impulsive, sure, but she had no idea why she was doing exactly what she was doing, and yet it seemed like the only thing she could do. Maybe it meant she really cared for Dan, although, at this point, she saw it more as a responsibility. Her feelings for Dan were certainly something she hadn't been so sure of lately. She definitely didn't think about Dan when Keith was all over her, except maybe about his fumbling ineptitude. With Dan, it was clothes off, him on top for a few minutes before pulling out and coming on her stomach. If he felt really imaginative, he would aim for her breasts or, sometimes, her face. Whenever he did that, she always wanted to ask him where the camera was. Keith wasn't like that. Today, he'd fucked her in her car in the parking garage at work and fucked her again when they got back to her apartment. But, with Keith, it was just that, fucking. Even though it had been going on for quite some time, there was no love there. No connection. And his virility had a tendency to turn brutal. She never really had to worry about sore jaws or a raw ass with Dan. Keith treated them as standard fare. With Keith, the words, "that hurts," were said in a wasted breath. But now she wondered if there even was a Dan. She knew it sounded severe, but Glowers Point, the Point, despite all its rolling hills and full-bloomed splendor, was a very severe place. Her thoughts ate up the road and turned the dusk to dark. Around Columbus, the traffic thickened and she pulled off an exit. She decided she had to find a phone. Unlike Dan, she wouldn't have anything to do with a cell phone, although she wished she had one now so she could make the calls without burning time. She pulled into a BP and used her credit card to call for information. "City and state," the bland feminine voice asked. "Glowers Point, Ohio," Karen spat. Not a religious person in the least, she had the urge to cross herself after speaking those words. She became aware of how impatient and out of breath she was. "That's another number. Let me get that for you." Karen wondered if operators were aware of how monstrously slow they were. The recording gave her the number and, having no pen or paper, she chose the extra toll to be connected automatically. "City and state." Another bland feminine voice. "This one may be a bit more Appalachian." "Glowers Point, Ohio." "Go ahead. I need the number for the Glowers Point Police Department." Again she chose to be connected automatically. The phone must have rang 15 times. "Glowers Point Emergency." A uniquely twangy female voice this time. Karen paused. What was she supposed to say? The words tangled in her mind and got stuck in her throat. The whole purpose of the call hinged upon the fact that Glowers Point wasn't the same town it used to be. That is, a town with a secret. A secret that all the townspeople knew and never talked about. She would be able to tell by the dispatcher's voice if it had changed or not. There was also the possibility that maybe Dan had had an actual emergency. Maybe he ran off the road or hit a deer or, Christ, she didn't know, suffered a fucking coronary there in his car. "Hello?" the voice said. Yeah, sorry. Is this the Glowers Point Police?" "Police, fire, and ambulance." Of course, Karen thought and then said, okay. "I need to find out if there's been an accident." "Ain't been none all day." "Usually, there is, but we ain't got no calls 'bout no accidents today." "No." The town hadn't changed a bit. The woman's voice made Karen think of walking into a room with your skirt tucked into the back of your hose and trying to carry on a normal conversation while the person you were talking to tried not to laugh. But there was something inside Karen that wouldn't let her drop it at that. It was futile, she knew, to try and penetrate their shell, but she pressed on anyway. "Can't you radio someone? To make sure?" "Nah. There ain't no need for that. If there'd been an accident, I'd have personally called in the county. Okay, Karen said, trying to think of a million other questions to ask this woman. Trying to create a conspirator for her madness, but, she knew, both she and the other woman were already part of the madness. Before Karen could think of anything else, the woman said, okay. Bye now, honey. Karen hung up the phone, feeling lost. The call should have made her feel relieved, but it served an opposite purpose. At least, she thought, Dan's probably not dead yet. There are some things worse than death. No. She didn't want to think about anything like that, the creepy cult stuff. Besides, Dan's a grown man, he can take care of himself. Karen laughed. She knew there was no taking care of yourself in the point. Being there was half the problem. As Karen wandered across the greasy parking lot to the store, only vaguely aware of what she was doing, the image of Jordan flashed through her memory, ripping in and gouging blood. There are some things worse than death. There are some things worse than death. There are some things worse than death. It was like she had to keep those words going like a chant so she didn't have to actually think about what those things were. She sat in the car and unfolded the Ohio road map. Karen could never forget the way to Glowers Point. She had always remembered it. Although, she had always thought she was remembering it only so she could avoid it in the future. She bought the map because she thought there might be some new way to get there. Perhaps a state route had been extended or a new highway created. Hell, maybe there was even a second Glowers Point in Ohio. The last few minutes were completely gone, eclipsed by the first 16 years of her life. She didn't remember going into the store. Didn't remember buying the map. Didn't remember. What she remembered was this: she and Allison and Jordan, Glowers Point High's most innocent threesome, had all gone down to the creek for a night of camping and drinking. After a couple hours, Jordan left the campfire to go squat in the woods. Time passed, but it was drunk time, moving way too fast. It was probably an hour before Karen or Allison wondered where Jordan was. She wasn't anywhere in the area immediately surrounding the fire. They made torches and searched a wider perimeter. Together, they scoured the trails, calling Jordan's name. Nothing. Throats full of dread. That was it. Had the rumors finally come true for one of them? By 4 a.m., Allison and Karen had given up hope. Maybe she just went home for some reason, they thought. They went back to Allison's and called the local police department and were immediately told that, no, there wasn't anyone fitting that description, no one picked up for public drunkenness, no one murdered, no volunteer emergency calls. They called the hospital over in Dayton, too, just to make sure. The only people left were Jordan's small circle of friends. Karen called the first one, the phone ringing. On about the fourth ring, from behind her, she heard Allison say, "Oh my God," and put her hand over her mouth. "Put down the phone, Kay. She found us." The voice on the other end picked up. Karen heard Jennifer Gentry's mom sleepily say, "Hello," while Karen was in the act of placing the phone back in its cradle. Karen followed Allison down the stairs and out the front door. Through the early dawn ground fog, they saw Jordan. Only she didn't look anything like Jordan. Once she saw Allison and Karen, she collapsed onto the front yard. Allison and Karen went over to her, inspecting the damage without touching her. "Call the police," Karen said. "No." Jordan shouted, a spray of blood coming from her mouth, ropes of it dangling from her bottom lip. Her eyes darted around in her head. Allison, disregarding Jordan's demand, rushed into the house to make the call. Anything to take her sight off the grisly heap in the front yard. The only thing Jordan wore was a bra, relatively mangled at this point. Blood covered her from head to toe. It was heavier in parts, like where clumps of her hair had been ripped out. As Jordan struggled to sit up, Karen noticed the series of deep red gashes down her back. Jordan reached out to Karen and said, "He said he was going to make me like him. Something about tormenting. I think he was one of them." "It's okay," Karen said, placing her hands on Jordan's shoulder. "There are some things worse than death." Karen knew what Jordan meant by one of them. They were the tormented. Karen had always figured they were as much myth as reality. Something for parents to scare little children with so they wouldn't wander off into the woods. But as Karen got older, into her teenage years, she began to see maybe a little bit of truth behind the mythic exaggerations. It didn't take her long to realize something was wrong when there seemed to be a student a week missing from the high school. Historically, the tormented were as old as the town itself. Call them the first rebellious teens in that area. The tormented were a group of adolescents, between the ages of 13 and 19, who broke off from the adult, church-centered society to found their own little cult. From everything Karen had heard, they'd been a peaceful lot. Their premise seemed to be that, rather than acting as slave hands on their parents' farms and being expected to follow their rules, why not work for themselves and make their own rules? Karen suspected that sex was somewhere at the center of it. The adults claimed they were decimating the innocence of their children. They ordered the youths to stop practicing, but it didn't work. Trying to create a conspirator for her madness, but, she knew, both she and the other woman were already part of the madness. Before Karen could think of anything else, the woman said, "Okay. Bye now, honey." Karen hung up the phone, feeling lost. The call should have made her feel relieved, but it served an opposite purpose. At least, she thought, Dan's probably not dead yet. There are some things worse than death. No. She didn't want to think about anything like that, the creepy cult stuff. Besides, Dan's a grown man, he can take care of himself. Karen laughed. She knew there was no taking care of yourself in the point. Being there was half the problem. As Karen wandered across the greasy parking lot to the store, only vaguely aware of what she was doing, the image of Jordan flashed through her memory, ripping in and gouging blood. There are some things worse than death. There are some things worse than death. There are some things worse than death. It was like she had to keep those words going like a chant so she didn't have to actually think about what those things were. She sat in the car and unfolded the Ohio road map. Karen could never forget the way to Glowers Point. She had always remembered it. Although, she had always thought she was remembering it only so she could avoid it in the future. She bought the map because she thought there might be some new way to get there. Perhaps a state route had been extended or a new highway created. Hell, maybe there was even a second Glowers Point in Ohio. The last few minutes were completely gone, eclipsed by the first 16 years of her life. She didn't remember going into the store. Didn't remember buying the map. Didn't remember. What she remembered was this: she and Allison and Jordan, Glowers Point High's most innocent threesome, had all gone down to the creek for a night of camping and drinking. After a couple hours, Jordan left the campfire to go squat in the woods. Time passed, but it was drunk time, moving way too fast. It was probably an hour before Karen or Allison wondered where Jordan was. She wasn't anywhere in the area immediately surrounding the fire. They made torches and searched a wider perimeter. Together, they scoured the trails, calling Jordan's name. Nothing. Throats full of dread. That was it. Had the rumors finally come true for one of them? By 4 a.m., Allison and Karen had given up hope. Maybe she just went home for some reason, they thought. They went back to Allison's and called the local police department and were immediately told that, no, there wasn't anyone fitting that description, no one picked up for public drunkenness, no one murdered, no volunteer emergency calls. They called the hospital over in Dayton, too, just to make sure. The only people left were Jordan's small circle of friends. Karen called the first one, the phone ringing. On about the fourth ring, from behind her, she heard Allison say, "Oh my God," and put her hand over her mouth. "Put down the phone, Kay. She found us." The voice on the other end picked up. Karen heard Jennifer Gentry's mom sleepily say, "Hello," while Karen was in the act of placing the phone back in its cradle. Karen followed Allison down the stairs and out the front door. Through the early dawn ground fog, they saw Jordan. Only she didn't look anything like Jordan. Once she saw Allison and Karen, she collapsed onto the front yard. Allison and Karen went over to her, inspecting the damage without touching her. "Call the police," Karen said. "No." Jordan shouted, a spray of blood coming from her mouth, ropes of it dangling from her bottom lip. Her eyes darted around in her head. Allison, disregarding Jordan's demand, rushed into the house to make the call. Anything to take her sight off the grisly heap in the front yard. The only thing Jordan wore was a bra, relatively mangled at this point. Blood covered her from head to toe. It was heavier in parts, like where clumps of her hair had been ripped out. As Jordan struggled to sit up, Karen noticed the series of deep red gashes down her back. Jordan reached out to Karen and said, "He said he was going to make me like him. Something about tormenting. I think he was one of them." "It's okay," Karen said, placing her hands on Jordan's shoulder. "There are some things worse than death." Karen knew what Jordan meant by one of them. They were the tormented. Karen had always figured they were as much myth as reality. Something for parents to scare little children with so they wouldn't wander off into the woods. But as Karen got older, into her teenage years, she began to see maybe a little bit of truth behind the mythic exaggerations. It didn't take her long to realize something was wrong when there seemed to be a student a week missing from the high school. Historically, the tormented were as old as the town itself. Call them the first rebellious teens in that area. The tormented were a group of adolescents, between the ages of 13 and 19, who broke off from the adult, church-centered society to found their own little cult. From everything Karen had heard, they'd been a peaceful lot. Their premise seemed to be that, rather than acting as slave hands on their parents' farms and being expected to follow their rules, why not work for themselves and make their own rules? Karen suspected that sex was somewhere at the center of it. The adults claimed they were decimating the innocence of their children. They ordered the youths to stop practicing, but it didn't work. Eventually, the members of the congregation decided the tormented needed to be scared back into their senses. The adult church corralled the townspeople and stormed Black Hill, where the tormented called home. The adults went about setting several fires, hoping the tormented would come down from the hill and repent. Like any stubborn, rebellious teenagers, they stayed put, headed for martyrdom. The fires raged to the top of the hill, but the tormented didn't go away. Over the years, they continued to grow. And more teenagers turned up missing. After seeing Jordan that night and hearing the things she said, Karen believed every word of it. Of course, that was only one of the legends. It wasn't even that night in particular as much as the things that happened after. Maybe what happened to Jordan hadn't been worse than death, but it seemed that way to Karen. As Jordan's wounds mended, her hair growing back, something inside of her seemed to be dying. Her eyes grew listless and vacant. Her skin became not just pale but nearly gray, ashen. And then, one day, she was gone. No one knew where she went, but Karen knew, everyone knew where she went. She was a tormented now, no longer alive, no longer really human. That was when Karen got really scared. She felt hunted. One of her friends was now missing from the circle. Would she be next? Whatever the tormented were, however many good intentions they'd had, they were something different now, something akin to vampires. Vampires that, more than blood, wanted innocence and sacrifice. Karen had seen the type of kids that disappeared from the high school. It wasn't the oversexed football players and cheerleaders. It wasn't the boisterous class clown or the hoodie girl who was rumored to sleep with the teachers. No. It was the shy ones. The wallflowers. The ones who went unnoticed and probably turned up at church on Sunday for lack of anything better to do. In short, it was people like Karen. There were times she went to bed at night and swore she heard someone else's breath in the room with her. Out the window, she saw flashes of white, someone's face. She answered telephone calls with no one on the other line. 3 or 4 of them a day. On the night she left the point, she woke up with one of them in her bed. She remembered him as the boy with the scar over his left eye and, amidst his pallid skin, those dancing orange eyes. She woke up because she was choking. The boy's hand crushed her windpipe and she had the panicked feeling that this was it. Images of Jordan skipped across her head, giving her an angry strength. Somehow she managed to pry the boy's hand from her neck. She had a large butcher knife in the nightstand she had started keeping there for safety. If she could just get to that. Her hand reached out. She made eye contact with the boy. His eyes were deep, the orange rimmed with black, but she didn't think they looked soulless. "I know what you are," she spat at him. "You took Jordan. You took Jordan. You took Jordan." Her hand clasped around the handle of the knife. "We need you," the boy said. Karen quickly brought the knife through the air and rammed it into the boy's side, ripping downward. He moaned and rolled off the bed. Karen kept the knife in front of her until the boy was out the window. Karen took the keys to her parents' car and drove it until it ran out of gas. She never called back home. Tried not to think of it ever again. There were nights when she missed her family. Anger usually dismissed that feeling. How could they possibly keep her there if they knew what was going on? 16 and alone, she stripped in clubs until she turned 18. The especially seedy places didn't care how fake the ID was. Once she was 18, life got a little bit easier. She was able to get her GED and start college with no questions asked. Now she was almost 30 and headed back to every childhood fear she'd ever had. She turned the radio on and up, driving the programmed route until fatigue overwhelmed her. She pulled off into a rest stop and convinced herself Dan was in no immediate danger. She convinced herself the whole situation was, maybe, just a coincidence. Crazily, exhausted, she convinced herself Dan had somehow found out about her secret childhood home, found out she wasn't from Idleville, a small town outside Richmond, Indiana, and had concocted this whole thing to show her she couldn't keep secrets from him. She convinced herself to sleep. She woke up at dawn and stepped out of the car. After a good stretch, she went in search of the coffee machines, pushing the extra strong button and waiting eagerly for the small paper cup to fill up. She got back into the car, a sheen of sweat already covering her. The sweat would be with her all day, slowly oozing out. Karen cursed the car's aging air conditioner. Resting the coffee on the dash, she pulled the map onto her lap and dug in the console for a pack of Camel lights that had been there for about 6 months. It was half empty. A little more than 1 cigarette a month wasn't too bad, she figured. She lit it with the car lighter and breathed in the stale smoke. Her muscles relaxed a little bit. Thank God for tobacco, she thought. Studying the map, she thought maybe, in the previous night's fatigue, she had missed some other way. No. Nothing new. Nothing quicker. Frustrated, she crumpled up the map and tossed it in the passenger side floorboard. And what if she just turned around? She almost had herself convinced she would simply run into Dan when she got back to the apartment. By that time she would be too embarrassed to tell him about her excursion. He would interrogate her. He loved to interrogate her. Sometimes she thought maybe that was the reason she was fucking Keith on the side, to see if she could still pass Dan's interrogations. If she let him beat her down mentally, then the last shreds of what they had, whatever it was, were gone. If she did find him down here and something had happened to him, she would tell him what she'd been doing and put the decision in his hands. If you both come back. There are some things worse than death. But she didn't want to think about that. There was something inside of her telling her maybe this didn't even really have anything to do with Dan. Like maybe she wasn't going down there out of any concern for him as much as the fulfillment of some sense of duty. It may have seemed self-involved, but, ever since Jordan's disappearance, Karen felt like she had been chosen for something. She shuddered at the thought of what that thing might be. Tossing her cigarette out the window, she lit up another one and forced the thoughts out of her head. The trees stormed by the window. The road thrummed beneath the car. Karen stared blankly ahead. In a couple of hours the coffee was long empty and the highway was way behind her. She turned onto a state route and stayed with that for a while, winding and twisting for miles, the summer foliage threatening to take over the road, the bugs hitting the windshield like soupy rain. The turnoff was around here somewhere. She almost thought she'd missed it until she saw a green sign, the gray-white reflective letters reading, Glowers Point 5. Almost there. Just stay on this road. Where are you, Dan? She thought. And then, let's get this the hell over with. Whatever it is. She couldn't help but speed, the feeling in her veins a collision of excitement and dread. She reached for the pack of cigarettes and lit another one, not even remembering tossing the last one out the window. The car had reached 80 by the time she saw the yellow and black sign indicating a sharp right turn. Shit, she thought, and nearly slammed on the brakes. She managed to take the turn more gracefully than she would have thought, the finesse of her youth, the ability to take these back-country woods turns half-drunk with nothing but a learner's permit in her pocket, coming back to her. Karen pictured Dan's car going off the road. Only he said he'd passed a sign saying he was in Glowers Point. So it had to be after that. Immediately after that. Not that it mattered, she would be able to cover just about every road in the point in a few hours. And then she saw the sign, hanging upside down from the two iron poles. She pulled the car over to the right. The road she was on was the one veering up and to the right, into the hills. This was the road that could take her into town. To the left, the road forked. This road was gravel, weeds sprouting up here and there. This was the road that would take her down into the point proper. If she followed that road, it wouldn't be long until she ran into the small trailer park by the river where she had lived out her first 16 years. She walked over to the other side of the road, tossing her cigarette away, and stood where the asphalt became stone. She tried to figure out how many seconds it had been from the time Dan said he saw the sign for Glowers Point and the moment the signal ended. She looked for some sense of trauma amidst the shrubs and undergrowth by the side of the road. Something roughly the size of a car. She took a deep breath. Out here, she couldn't smell anything but the woods. Karen had come all this way and only had an inkling as to what the hell she expected to find. The car idled behind her. That was how hopeless it all felt, she hadn't even bothered shutting off the engine. She sighed deeply and put her hands on her hips. Did she even want to find him? But he's not what this is about. This was about her. She realized that. If something happened to Dan, then so be it. He was a grown man. If he was dead, then she would have to deal with that. If something else happened to him, something worse than death, then he would have to rely on some other source of help. The best thing she could do would be to get back in her car, drive back up north, and let Keith fuck her until Glowers Point was just a fading memory. She wasn't responsible for Dan. He didn't even know of her association with this place. He came in without me, she thought, let him get out without me. Taking a final cursory survey, she turned to go back to the car. Wait. She saw something. Didn't she? Sure. That little blotch of white way off to her right, in the midst of all that green. Instead of heading back to the car, she took a couple steps to her right, 1 foot on the road, 1 foot on the wild grass descending down to the creek bed, getting wilder as it went. She turned and put both feet on the grass, the woods in front of her. The wind picked up, blowing up under her shirt like a cold hand, coaxing her deeper into the woods, down into that nearly dry creek bed. What the fuck are you doing? An inner voice screamed at her. You're Karen Bruckner. You're 28 years old. You're from Idleville, Indiana. You're not 16. It was all behind you. Leave it there. They took Jordan. They sent me screaming from my home. They took Jordan. They took Jordan and dragged her into something that was worse than death. She found herself scrambling down the slope and stupidly thinking, Dan wears a lot of white. Thunder rumbled and Karen looked up to see dense black clouds rolling over the top of the hill. The white thing moved. Did it move? Wasn't it over there just a second ago? The thunder hollered through the hills, blowing through Karen's skull. She had forgotten the intensity of it. The rain started heavy, soaking her hair and clothes. Dan, she shouted. Dan. Are you down there? Not about Dan. She couldn't see the white thing at all anymore and it was getting very dark, like going from noon to dusk in under a minute. Karen stood in the creek bed, water up to her ankles, smelling the clean ozone. There are some things worse than death. She saw the white thing, worse than death, and it looked like it was running. Without hesitation, she took off running after it, the rain and the water at her feet making her feel like she was running through a dream. Dan, she called, trying to cover up what she was doing with some type of semi-rational pretense. She couldn't really admit to herself she had come back to the point to stalk down all the nightmares of her childhood, but that was exactly what she was doing. Karen had been strong. The fear had broken her down. It had broken down all of her friends. After Jordan's disappearance, the fear became real. There is nothing horror movie about real fear. The talk of finishing up high school and running off to the same Ivy League college vanished. They were broken. They were afraid. That feeling came back to Karen. That feeling of lying in bed every night, a butcher knife in the nightstand beside her. And most nights she would wake up, one of an eventual many, and feel that blade at her throat. Always the feeling of someone just outside her window, or just outside her door, or just beside the bed. Sometimes she woke up because she felt a cold hand, sometimes at her throat, sometimes on her cheek, sometimes running slowly up her inner thigh. Was that what they wanted? Her fucking virginity? Sorry guys, she thought, I gave that away to the first fat fuck to give me a job. And that was when she had felt the fear the most. When she had left the point and was all alone, doing things she never would have done otherwise. Things she did solely in extremis, to stay alive another day, another week. That's when she hated that place the most. That's when she blamed the tormented the most. When she was doing things she never would have done otherwise. Karen struggled to the further bank of the creek, regaining her footing, and continued after the thing in white. Rain and darkness separated them. Karen's breaths became wet and ragged. A scream of thunder. A flash of lightning and everything lit up for only a second. But a second was long enough to recognize the face of the figure as it turned to look behind it. It was Jordan. That's impossible. But hadn't everything else seemed impossible, too? Why, at this point, should she question anything? How could she question anything? Another belt of thunder. Another flashbulb of lightning and Jordan was gone. The thing in white had vanished. Karen kept running. A few more yards and she came upon the place where she had lost track of Jordan. She stopped, standing there in a sort of bemused stupor. She ran a hand through her hair, holding it out from her scalp and feeling it smack wetly down on the back of her neck. To her right, from the creek, she heard a sucking sound. Here, the creek widened in a circular pool nearly twice its usual width. Instinctively, she knew what she had to do. That's great. Come all the way out here to drown yourself in a fucking creek. Jordan had vanished. Karen realized part of her problem when she was 16 was she had never really questioned where Jordan had gone to that first time. Now, here she was, faced with that dilemma again. Only, this time, she wouldn't pacify herself with answers and legends and fear. Sometimes you had to do stuff you were afraid of. She realized that now. She looked up at the sky and wondered, for just a moment, if there was a God up there. She laughed crazily. If there was, he has to be the sickest son of a bitch in the universe, she thought. She looked at the spiraling whirlpool and, without another second's hesitation, dived in. She half expected the water to be freezing, but it wasn't. It wasn't even the texture of water. It was somehow lighter than water, silkier. Being surrounded by it, she thought of amniotic fluid, like she was in the womb. Ridiculous, of course. Time got messed up while she was in there. It felt like it came and went within seconds, but when she emerged at the end of it, on the other side, she had the feeling weeks, possibly years had passed or reversed. Yes, that was it. She was 16 again, or felt like it, walking slowly toward the black maw of her fear. She opened her eyes and looked at her new surroundings. It was nighttime, but Karen didn't think it seemed like real nighttime. It was like what she imagined a movie set would look like if the director called for darkness. She realized it was a full moon. The sky overhead was totally clear and starless, void of anything except the moon's alien surface, reflecting back a cold light. The trees here were squat and without leaves, and yet the air on her skin didn't feel like winter air. It was chilly, but there was an underlying balm she found comforting. Was she still in Glowers Point? Was she still even alive? There was something of an afterlife in this new landscape. Some ethereal quality. A certain level of unreality. She captured a scent of earth, good clean dirt, rising up from the ground. There was another scent there. The smell of a smoldering fire, after the fire and smoke and coals are gone and the only thing left, like a memory, is its odor. She should have been afraid. She had been terrified just a few moments ago, her feet on familiar ground. Now she was surrounded by something she was totally unfamiliar with, and the fear had vanished. In front of her, close and looming, was what looked like a church. The church of the earth, of course, she thought. The tormented's place of worship. How was it still standing? She thought for sure she remembered hearing about how it had been burnt to the ground. Nevertheless, there it was, right in front of her, majestic in its lopsided decay. The windows were gone. The wooden slats of the exterior were shiny burnt black and brittle looking. The steeple truncated 2/3 of the way up. She wondered what type of symbol had adorned the top of it. Maybe it had been a cross. From everything she'd heard, it didn't sound like the tormented had developed a religion in any way similar to Christianity. The doorway was one of those enormous, arching, double-door affairs. The doors were gone, some of the heavy stones used to make the arch had fallen away as well. The whole structure seemed to somehow lean toward her, like the front of it was sinking into the earth. This gave the entranceway the appearance of being like the opening to a grave, leading down into the earth. She would be going in there. There was no other choice. Slowly, she walked toward the church. As she drew closer, she noticed the dim blue light glowing inside. There would be someone there to welcome her then. Her sense of fear was admonished by need for closure. Whatever waited for her inside, she had no doubt it was going to be some kind of ending, either the end of her or the end of Glowers Point and its ongoing pull. Closer now, she noticed other details about the church. On either side of the doorway, hanging like porch lights, were her parents. Their hands and feet were bound. Their faces looked skyward, mouths bent and twisted. Their bodies were blackened, most of their clothes burnt away. This should have stopped her in her tracks, but it didn't. For her, her parents had died a long time ago. It had been easier to get through the day if she told herself they were dead. She stepped into the church of the earth. Is this my something worse than death? She thought, looking around her. The hanging, charred corpses lined the inside of the church, suspended precisely at the same level like Bible pictures. On either side of her, worn stone pews rose up out of the ground. People sat, here and there, on the uncomfortable-looking things. They turned their sullen faces toward her as she approached the altar. Above the altar was the pulpit. Behind the pulpit were the choir risers. These were virtually filled, the same sullen faces as out in the pews, piously turned up from their stained white robes, except these were more plentiful and mostly female. All of them looked very young to Karen. Softly, from the risers, a voice sang out. She looked up to meet the voice and saw that it was Jordan. "Jordan," she called. More voices joined in the soft chant. To her right, she heard footsteps. She looked to see a man, a boy, emerge from a small, wasted door. It was the boy with the scar over his eye, those crazy blazing eyes honing in on her and closing the distance. "Karen," he whispered. "Who are you?" she asked. "Does that really matter? This is my church. You came here. I should ask, who are you? But I know who you are. What do you want with me? What did you want with me?" The boy laughed. "So much older and still so innocent. Is that what you wanted? My innocence? My virginity? You're way too late if that's what you wanted. Oh, I know that. The bar in Newport, where you got your first job. Remember that fat greasy man who didn't bother taking the cigar out of his mouth when he fucked you in the ass?" Karen looked at the boy, her fear slowly returning. Staring into his face, his expression somewhat bland, she saw it shift from his own handsome face into that other face she would never forget, although the name she had long since put out of her head, and then dissolved back into the boy's original face. The boy laughed and his face changed again, kaleidoscoping into a multitude of other faces. Some of them were men who had been nice to Karen, men she wanted. Others, a good many others, some of them forgotten, were men she had slept with just for a place to stay, maybe something to eat. Finally, it shifted into Dan's and then Keith's. Holding out a hand, the boy braced himself on the pulpit. "My God," he said. "I think I almost made you depraved." Karen felt as though something essential had been stolen. The fear had slowly welled throughout the boy's demonstration and now pounded along like a train at full speed. "So if you had me all those times, why now, why here?" The boy moved closer to her, cradled her chin in his hand. "There's more to it than just sex. You make everything too simple. In a way, this doesn't even have anything to do with you. I don't understand. I wouldn't expect you to. Here's what you need to understand, when I wanted you to come, you didn't. You had your chance to get it over with and you chose to draw it out. But the conclusion is inevitable. Can't you smell the death?" She wanted to turn and run but the boy's grip had dropped to her neck and tightened. "Fuck you," she said. "When you pass through Glowers Point, you enter an agreement whether you want to or not. If you are young, then you belong to us. If you are older, then you mean nothing to us. You stand in direct opposition to us. Look around you." Karen looked at the people hanging from the walls. Some of them were people she recognized, teachers, shopkeepers who worked in town, random faces. None of them were teenagers. Why does it keep happening? A long time ago, there were atrocities played out here. The town had to die. The young people had to be turned away from their parents' way of life. They had to become something different. Somehow, you got away. You didn't give us time to react. But I have you here now and you're too old for the turning. Summoning all her strength, she attempted to bolt. The boy's grip tightened, shutting off her wind, and he drove her to the floor of the church. Within seconds, 2 members of the congregation had risen and moved toward her and the boy. Each of them grabbed a hand. The boy moved in front of her and pulled a whip-like thing from the sleeve of his shirt. It had the diameter of a quarter and ran the length of his arm. At the end, it had a curved piece of metal, like a talon. She tried kicking but the boy held her legs down and put a foot on each ankle. He bent to raise up her shirt, exposing her tender back. With a quick gasp, he brought the whip down across her back. She shrieked out in pain, her fingernails biting into her palms. Unlike a clean cut from glass or a knife, a cut that somehow caused numbness, this cut burned with savage life. She could feel the wound hanging open, as though the very atmosphere irritated it. The boy brought the whip down again and again. She couldn't help but scream. The fear consumed her. And it wasn't just the fear of death, it was the fear of living. In only a few minutes, the boy had told her the life she thought she had led wasn't really her life at all. She was merely a pawn. Insignificant. The other 2 members of the congregation moved away. Karen realized, somewhere, in the course of this, the choir's chanting had risen in volume and intensity. The boy knelt down beside her, placed a hand just inside one of the gashes in her back. The pain disappeared. "There are some things worse than death," the boy said, stroking the lip of the wound. "Join us," he whispered. "Join us in death." She felt his hand probe deeper into the wound. And then another hand. She felt more and more hands on her and the chanting rolled through her head, dragging some inner part of her to some other place. From behind her, she heard the sounds of celebration, the soft crackle of a fire. Karen realized something worse than death was finally happening.